Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are tuning in across the fruited plain around the world and in neighborhood after neighborhood. We are so glad that you are joining us for this week's edition of Stories and Myths. I'm here with John, lost my internet connection, C. Farrell. How are you, John?
I didn't put the C in there, but I'm doing well. Doing well. Just about a minute ago, I lost my connection and my computer went froze up, and I'm glad that I'm back. And so I do apologize in advance if something happens and I lose connectivity for a little bit. I've never seen that happen before.
Well, I am glad that you're back as well. And how are things? Your son started school, this week, right?
Last week. My
how
oldest
is that
son,
going?
He's going really well. He's going to Cabarrus Kannapolis Early College High School and as a ninth grader, and which is a little different from the traditional high school. He'll graduate in 4 years. He'll graduate with a high school diploma and a college degree, an associate's degree. So he's excited about that. And then in 2 weeks, or a week and a half now, my youngest son, who's a fifth grader or will be a fifth grader, will be starting school.
So. All right. Very good. Well, I'm about to set off on a journey. I'm going halfway across the country to St. Louis for
St. Louis, meet me at the fair.
Yeah, it won't be a fair. It will be the Christian Product Expo, which is the largest gathering of Christian bookstores and publishers and publicists and authors and ministers around the country. And so I'm excited to be going there. I will be meeting with Christian bookstore owners, and meeting with various different kinds of folks to talk about my different books and hopefully to encourage them to stock their shelves with those books.
And what books are those that you'll be promoting?
The ones behind me.
Right.
Yes. So it should be an entertaining, interesting time. So I'll probably do a couple of research stops along the way. I had stopped at Fort Donelson a couple of years ago after I had gone to the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library, and then I was heading up to Pennsylvania to visit with my parents. And so I stopped at Fort Donelson, but I didn't have enough time to get over to Fort Henry, which was the first fort that Grant defeated. It actually wasn't Grant. It was his planning, but it was the Navy that defeated Fort Henry. But then Grant and the Navy working together defeated Fort Donelson. So I plan to stop at Fort Henry because it's kind of right on the way.
Nice.
And then also there may be a couple other stops depending on how much time I have. Mark Twain's Birthplace is about an hour and a half from where.
Hannibal?
Yes.
Hannibal.
Well, not his birthplace, but where he grew up. He was born in Florida, Missouri, which is a little bit further west, but Hannibal is about an hour and a half from where we're going to be. So if I find the time, I might zing up there as well. So should be an interesting time.
Awesome. I plan to hear, or I look forward to hearing some stories about it next weekend at the office and here on your podcast.
Stories and myths. That's right.
Yes.
So what do we got on tap for this evening?
So we're actually going to be talking about one of your Grant books. We're going to be talking about the leadership one. Just got a couple questions about that. And so this is the second.
It is called
The Leadership Principles of Ulysses S. Grant.
That's right. Which is the companion book to the biography, Victor, The Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant. So,
and this one came out in May
of 2021.
Right. So
and the biography, Victor, came out in April.
So just a month apart. And so,
yeah.
So I'll go ahead and jump right into my first question. So Teddy Roosevelt declared in 1900, mightiest among the mighty, dead loom the three great figures of Washington, Lincoln, and Grant. So why did Grant's reputation suffer such a decline since that point?
Well, it's interesting. I don't know if there would be anyone today who would say the same thing. Now, everything shifts with context and with time. And we've had an awful lot, we've had more than a century since Teddy Roosevelt made that quote. And there have been a lot of great American leaders since that time. But when you look back from 1900 back to 1776 and consider what Teddy Roosevelt said, what I didn't share in that quote was that he said in the second tier, there would be people like not Patrick Henry, but Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin. Those Teddy Roosevelt considered those second tier, and he considered the first tier Washington, Lincoln, and Grant. Basically, people of that era looked at Washington as the father of the country. And he, not only as a general, but also as a two-term president, and his important contribution of not going for a third term, but retiring and saying, I'm not a king. We don't want a king here in America. We want a president. And so that very important contribution. Then they looked at Lincoln in his work in saving the Union and keeping it from being divided and conquered. And they looked at Grant in two different ways. One was his military strategy, working with Lincoln. I mean, Lincoln and Grant had very similar strategy, but Lincoln didn't have the military training that Grant had. And so Lincoln needed Grant. That's why 3 full years went by where the Union lost most of the time. The only place that the Union was winning was out west, where Grant was in charge, because Grant was a military genius as far as his strategy was concerned and as far as his discipline was concerned. And so that's why Lincoln brought him east, so that the North's strongest general went up against the South's strongest general in Robert E. Lee. So it was kind of like Rocky Balboa against Apollo Creed. And and Grant won. And so he not only was hailed for winning the war, but he also helped the country steer through the dangerous waters of Reconstruction and of the rise of Jim Crow racism in the South. Basically, the Southern aristocrats and politicians who were in charge before the war very quickly became in charge again after the war, because they suppressed the black vote. And so it was the same people voting for the same people, and they wanted to continue slavery just in different terms. And that is, the Jim Crow racism. And so Grant fought against that for all 8 years of his 2 terms as president. And this is what we forget. I know growing up that I was told that Grant was one of the worst presidents we ever had because of the scandals that took place. Well, that was nothing but Southern, pro-Confederate propaganda. It's simply not true. The truth of the matter is that Grant is one of the most important presidents we ever had, because he kept us together. He kept the country unified. He knocked down Jim Crow. He knocked down the KKK. He came out with the Civil Rights Act of 1875. He came out with the anti-KKK laws. And so his, slogan was, let us have peace. And he did that in 3 ways. One, he tried to reconcile wherever he could with the South, as long as they obeyed the laws, federal, state, and local. 2, he kept the Union Army deployed throughout the South to enforce that. And 3, he helped to form the Justice Department, and his attorney general, along with Grant, went after the KKK, and basically in the courts, they wiped them out. And so the KKK was pretty much toothless for the next 20 years because of Ulysses S. Grant. We forget how important he was, not only as general, but also as president. And then, of course, as elder statesman, in those last 2 years as he was writing his memoirs, he not only wrote about his experiences, but he reminded the country that the war was not about states' rights. The war was not about tariffs. The only way the war was about tariffs and states' rights was as it was connected to slavery. The war was about slavery. Grant made that very clear in his memoirs, and he made it very clear to the people that he spoke to, including Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. He said, we had to destroy slavery. It was a cancer upon our country. And so that is why the people of the 19th century, next to Lincoln, and very closely next to Lincoln, saw Ulysses S. Grant as one of the great leaders in American history. Happily, after 100 years of what is called the Law School, which is a pro-Confederate philosophy of writers and historians and media moguls, after 100 years of knocking Grant's reputation down and raising Lee's reputation up, after the Civil Rights Movement, writers and historians and educators started to take a second look at Grant and started to look at the actual documents, which is what historians are supposed to do and what journalists are supposed to do. And so in the last 25 or 30 years, there has been a re-examination of the importance of Ulysses S. Grant. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote these 2 books, Victor and Forward.
Awesome. So Grant looked for the advantage in every setback. So how was this a key to his success?
Well, I mentioned earlier Fort Henry and Fort Donaldson. Mm-hmm. Grant saw the strategy right away when he was employed as a colonel in the Union Army in Illinois. And he was placed under General Fremantle, who was the general of the West at the time. Fremantle gave Grant a promotion to brigadier general, and he basically said, go get him. Well, Fremantle, unfortunately, made some really bad decisions, and Lincoln removed him and brought in General Halleck. Halleck was a good politician, but not a very good general. He was good at the paper pushing part of being a general. He was not good in the field. He just wasn't good in the field. And yet Grant now had to answer to Halleck. And so Grant saw very clearly that the key to defeating the South was to control the rivers. It would be like us controlling the highways and airports today, because rivers could be moved, things and troops and supplies and weapons could be moved in rivers, both in the summertime and in the wintertime. So it was vitally important. And so Grant saw that what he needed to do first was to take the 2 forts that were on the Cumberland and the Tennessee rivers, Fort Henry, which was an earthen fort, and it was not very well built, and then Fort Donaldson, which was a combination of earth and also wood stockade, which was actually extremely well built. And so he went to Halleck to request permission. All the while, Grant was making plans for how he would do this. In fact, he went and he talked to the admiral of the Navy, because back then there was no joint chiefs of staff. The Navy was in charge of the Navy and the Army was in charge of the Army. Right. So the Army generals had to go and ask for permission to use the Navy boats. And so Grant went and spoke with the commandant of the Navy in that area, who agreed that that was what needed to happen. I believe it was Admiral Foote. And so Grant went to Halleck with this plan. And because it wasn't Halleck's plan, he said, no, I don't want you to do that, even though it was the obvious thing to do. And so Grant almost quit because of this, because he was so discouraged by this politics. And yet he thought, okay, his wife encouraged him and said, no, tough it out, stay there, something will change. Well, what changed is that Abraham Lincoln was sick and tired of the Union just sitting around doing nothing. And so he gave an order that by this date, I want action. Well, the only plan that Halleck had was Grant's. And so he took it on as his own and said, oh, I think that is a very good idea, now that Lincoln ordered him to move forward. And so he went ahead and gave permission for Grant to go ahead and to attack. So had Grant not made his plans, had Grant not been proactive, by the time Halleck would have said yes, there would have been nothing in place. But Grant had not only made his plans, he had started stockpiling all the equipment and the weapons and the uniforms and everything that was needed. The Navy got all their plans together. So as soon as Halleck said yes, they were off, I think the next day or maybe 2 days. Wow. And it had been raining torrentially. And so the Tennessee River had flooded. And so the Navy floated right into Fort Henry. They literally floated right into the fort because it had flooded. And so it was, the Army never even got there. And so the Navy telegraphed to General Grant saying, Fort Henry has fallen. Grant forwarded that to Halleck, but he never asked permission to move on to Fort Donaldson. He just went and did it because he thought, if I ask permission, he might say no. So I'm just going to go with interpreting his original orders as taking both forts.
Right.
And so Grant got there and surrounded 3 sides of the fort. The other side was facing the river. And so the Navy gunboats went down the Tennessee and then up the Cumberland and started shelling Fort Donaldson from the river. But the Confederates had built a very good fort. And the Confederates actually took out the gunboats. Oh, wow. They didn't sink, but they damaged them and killed a lot of the Navy sailors. So the Navy actually retreated because their boats were not capable of keeping up the war. And so Grant said, okay, I guess we're just going to have to take this. And so he gave the order to charge on all fronts. It took several days, but eventually they were able to overwhelm the forts, and they won. So that's an example of how Grant made his plans, had his strategy, but then he stuck to it and pushed forward.
Awesome. So during the Civil War, General Grant had a gift for identifying talent and trustworthy people. So how did this help the Union to win the war?
Well, the generals that we know of as the great generals, many, if not most of them, were picked by Grant at one point along the line.
Okay.
And those that we don't really know about, or at least that your typical person doesn't know about, either got on Grant's bad side, which could happen. There were some generals who really made him angry, some that he fired. McClernand was an example. So McClernand was a political general. This was one of the crazy things about the Civil War, is that they had most of the generals and officers were West Point trained, or one of the other military colleges like the Citadel or the VMI, right. But the majority were from West Point. However, because the war was looked on as a Republican war at the beginning, Lincoln needed to pull over to his side Democrats who agreed with the war, because many Democrats did not, and they actually fought tooth and nail. They were called Copperheads because they would snip the face of liberty off of a copper penny and affix it to their shirt or their hat or their lapel of their coat. And so they were named Copperheads. There's actually a movie named Copperhead that kind of gives that perspective. It's very good. Ron Maxwell, the director of Gettysburg and Gods and Generals, also directed this very good movie. But so Lincoln needed these Democrats, and so he turned several. I mean, right now it seems ridiculous, but he turned several of these politicians into generals. And so some of the more famous were Fremont, that I had mentioned, McClernand, who was actually Lincoln's friend in Illinois. And then probably the most famous or infamous is General Ben Butler. who got the name the Beast, Ben Butler, because he was put in charge of New Orleans after New Orleans was taken by the Navy. And there was a lot of, uprising of the Southerners. Even though the city had fallen, the citizens were doing things like, women would come out and drop their chamber pot onto the heads of generals and things like that. And there was a lot of different things.
Nice.
And Butler basically laid down the law and said, if this happens again, the women are going to jail, and any men that pull anything like that, we're going to hang without trial.
Oh, wow.
And so they called him the Beast Ben Butler. And actually, museums still have chamber pots from that era where they put the picture of Ben Butler in the bottom of the bowl. And those still exist to this day. You can get, it's a collector's item.
How would you like to be like, oh, have you seen my ancestor's picture? Look at this chamber pot. His photos in it. What a heck of a...
It's rather hysterical. But at any rate, so most of these political generals were terrible generals. They were good politicians, and that worked for a time, but most of them, got pushed out. So McClernand made the mistake of ranting against Grant in the newspaper, which was against Army regulations, and the next day he was gone. As soon as Grant saw that, he fired him. Ben Butler held on for a long, long time, but finally he did some things that were out of bounds, and Grant fired him.
Did he get hit by a chamber pot?
What's that?
By a chamber pot?
No, but he made some mistakes, and basically he became very ineffective, bottled up in what was called the Bermuda 100, which was just a small little area south of Richmond, and he couldn't go north, south, east, or west. They were stuck right there. Grant said they were like a wine bottle firmly corked. And so he got rid of Ben Butler. But some of the people that Grant raised up included General William Tecumseh Sherman, who Grant knew at West Point. And he had left, and people thought he was crazy at the beginning of the war because he said it's going to take this long and it's going to be this many casualties. He was almost exactly right on in the end. His predictions were almost right on. But at that time, people said that he was crazy. Well, Grant, they came together and they realized that they worked very well together. And so what Sherman said at one point, he said, Grant was with me when I was crazy, and I stayed with Grant when he was drunk, and now we stay with each other always. And they did. And the two of them were the two most important generals, really, in the war. Another person that Grant identified and brought under his wing was General Philip Sheridan, who was actually quite young. And he led the charge at Chattanooga that took the hill there. And everybody thought, how in the world did that happen? Well, a lot of people believe that a large part of it was Sheridan's leadership. And so Grant brought him out east with him and put him in charge of the cavalry, which had not been very successful up to that point. And within only a few weeks, Sheridan had whipped it into shape. And within only a couple of months, Jeb Stuart, who had led the Southern cavalry, was killed at Yellow Tavern. And the Southern cavalry was never as good as it was up to that point. And the Northern cavalry kept getting better and better and better. And so again and again and again, another one would be Grant's chief of staff, John Rawlins, who was the lawyer for Grant's father's leather goods store. But Grant saw something in him, and he named him chief of staff, even though he didn't have any military ability. But he did have great leadership ability and organizational ability. So again and again and again, Grant identified these key people. And it's I attribute that in the book. By the way, in forward, the leadership principles of Ulysses S. Grant, what I do is not only talk about Grant's leadership, but also I tie it to modern day scholarship. So I show different things that modern researchers and educators and scholars have discovered about leadership. And then I show how many of these principles were in play in Grant's life before we ever knew that they really made a difference. And so one of the things that I point out is there's a book called Good to Great by Jim Collins, which is an excellent book about organizational leadership and corporate leadership and structure. And basically what Jim Collins and his team recognized is that he talked about the bus. And you've probably heard the term getting the right people on the bus.
Yeah.
But he takes it a step further. He said, it's not just getting the right people on the bus, it's getting the right people in the seats, in the right seats on the bus.
Right.
And we've all experienced that, where there's someone in the organization that's there because they're a cousin or they're somebody's favorite or whatever. And everybody scratches their head and says, this person is not in the right seat and it's harming the organization. You might have most of the seats filled properly, but one key seat that is not filled properly, or two, can cause that bus to stall. And that was one of the things that Grant did very well as general. Conversely, he did not do very well in that regard as president, because as president, he took his buddies, his friends from the military, most of them, or associated with the military, and he just gave them jobs. And that came back to haunt him. He didn't do the due diligence that he did during the Army years. And that is one of the reasons why there were all these scandals. Now, Grant was never involved in one of them. And that's what the historians and the Lost Cause School, they kind of forget to tell us that. They say he was such a terrible president because of these scandals, but they don't tell you that he was never involved in any of them. What his problem was that he allowed them to go too long. He couldn't believe that his friends would do this kind of thing, because Grant was a person of tremendous character and integrity. And he thought that everybody who he knew were the same as him. And it took him too long to act to move these people out who were corrupt. And unfortunately, it tainted his presidency, but it didn't taint him.
Interesting. So how is Grant's principle, do what is right, even if it's not popular, how is that still relevant today?
Anywhere you look. I mean, I'd like to hear you give me an idea on that. Do what is right, even if it's not popular. What would be a modern day example that you could think of?
Well, I go back to an article I wrote about my father, and do you remember what? Or not my father, my son.
Right. Yeah, you as a father.
Right, as a father. I wrote an article a couple weeks ago called "The Faith of a Son," and my oldest son was an 8th grader. He's now a 9th grader, but it's all about a conversation I had with him on the last day of 8th grade, where he has a very, very strong relationship with Christ, and he's not ashamed to highlight it or to showcase that in any way. And so and he takes his prayer very seriously, and every day before lunch in middle school, in the middle of the middle school cafeteria, he prays. And a conversation that I never got a clear answer whether it happened on the last day of school that his conversation with this guy happened, or a couple days before. But my conversation with him happened the night of his last day of school. And basically one of his friends asked him, why you pray every day before lunch? A lot of us think you're weird. And his immediate reaction was like, so? And they're like, but aren't you concerned that people think you're weird? And his response literally was, if they have a problem with me praying, that's their issue. It's what I do. It's what I want to do. There's nothing wrong with it. And I'm going to honor my father by praying to him. And even though he's not doing what is popular, he's doing what is right as a Christian. And so I take great pride in that. And it's something personally I had told him, I would like, as a father who wants him to be as have as many friends as possible and be liked by all. I was trying to come up with suggestions like, hey, why don't you walk, or why don't you say your prayer like while you're in line buying your food, or while you're walking down the hallway to the cafeteria, so you don't have to pray in the middle of the cafeteria among all these eighth graders and seventh graders. And he's like, why? Why should I, just because they're not comfortable with it, why should I change my habits and sacrifice my relationship with God for that reason? And I was kind of ashamed. I was like, how could I, as a father who wants my son to have a deep relationship with Christ, how could I recommend that or have these suggestions? And so the lesson I learned was, hey, sometimes the greatest lessons in faith are from those you're raising, that might just be in your own household, that you don't even realize that. As a father, I learned a very, very valuable lesson. And as a person who, in my own walk with Christ, I was like, I wish I had done that as well too. So, and it is definitely goes back to what we're talking about, the principle of do what is right, even if it's not popular.
Absolutely.
So
that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that story. And I encourage people to go to inspiration.org and to read John's story. What's the title?
It's called The Faith of a Son.
Okay. You can just look that up on inspiration.org. Thinking about this question, I go back to the Declaration of Independence, that where it was stated that all men are created equal. Now, God made man, male and female, he created them. So a female is just as much part of mankind as a male. And so when we talk about equality, there is equality among men and women. Now, it took a while for this country to come to an understanding, not only of equality among the races, or among men and women, but also equality among the races. And today, I would add to that the protection of human beings who are in the womb. There's always an argument that the victim is not fully human. So a woman was a second-class citizen to the men. Slaves were not fully human. They were somewhere between a beast and a human. And that was basically, the awful Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court that said that he was not a man. In regard to the Holocaust, for example, the Nazis said that not only the Jews were not human, but they were vermin. They used that term, like rats or cockroaches. In the same way that rats and cockroaches need to be exterminated, the Jews needed to be exterminated. And so today, the argument in favor of people having abortion is that this is not a human being, it's just a blob of tissue. And so people of character, people who believe not only in the Bible, but people who believe truly that all are created equal. If we are all created equal, when does creation happen? Creation happens, and science now has shown this to be true beyond any shadow of a doubt, that creation of a human being happens at conception. Everything is there for that to become a human being. Dr. Ben Carson said, if it's not a human being, then why are we taking those human aborted fetuses and using them for doing research on human beings? If they're not human beings, they are human beings. And so there's always this, it's easier to do away with someone that is not a human being or is not, is something less than human, but that's not the right thing. And that was what Grant came to understand. He came to understand that, his father and his mother were both abolitionists, but his father was so bombastic and pushy, and Grant was such a gentle kind of a introvert that he rebelled, not necessarily against abolition as much as against his father, I think. But when he was given a slave, he worked that slave. So he had this cognitive dissonance that was going on, this struggle within himself. But he came to the point where he started to realize, no, slaves are men, just like you and I. And so at his lowest point, when he was at his worst financial position of his life, he could have sold that slave for $1,000, which in the 1850s would have been a lot of money, and it would have given him probably a couple years of breathing room. But instead, he gave freedom to that slave. He took his family and moved up north because he knew that the conflict was inevitable, and that he told Otto von Bismarck later on that when slavery fired upon Fort Sumter, everyone who was loyal knew that it was a cancer that could not be negotiated with. It had to be destroyed.
Okay. So I was wondering if you could please give some examples of Grant's principles, or his principle, think creatively and then take calculated risks.
Two of the most important places, really where Grant shined, and it wasn't just that he shined, but his strategy helped win the war. And that was at Vicksburg and then in the Overland Campaign. So Vicksburg was this huge citadel that sat up on top, and it's still a city today. I visited there. Sits up on top of this large bluff, and there's a big cliff that goes down to the Mississippi River. And so the Confederates were able to hold that city. And so Grant knew that that city needed to be taken so that the Union would then control the entire Mississippi all the way north to south. And so he tried all kinds of different things. The problem was that to the north of the city were all these bayous and swamps. To the west was the river, which protected, and the bluff. To the east were all these fortifications that had been built by the Confederates. And there was a very large garrison of soldiers under General Pemberton, who was a Northerner who left the North to fight for the South because his wife was from the South. Well, that's why we speculate that's why he fought for the South. And then to the south, it was wide open, but they didn't believe that the Northern troops could get there because everything was so difficult to get around. And so there were little garrisons in the South, but not a lot. And so Grant knew that he needed to get around to the south of Vicksburg to attack, but they couldn't get there because of the swamps, because of there were not proper bridges, there were not proper roads, there were entrenchments, there were troops. And so Grant spent from the fall of 1862 all the way to July 4th of 1863, first coming up with a plan and then executing that plan. And so at first, there were different ideas that different generals had. Some of them talked about taking gunboats down these very narrow rivers that had all these trees overhanging. And so they tried to do that, but they kept hitting trees that were under the water. And then they'd get stuck, and the Confederates would shoot them like, fish in a barrel from the shore. Or one of the other exciting things is the gunboats would be going down a river, and they'd get stuck, and all of a sudden snakes would start falling from the trees onto the soldiers or onto the sailors in the boats. And there were alligators that were going up and down. I mean, it's the swamp. It's, right, tropical. Yeah. And so Grant had troops that were going and diving deep under the water to saw these trees to get them out of the way, to try and get them down. At one point, he had the troops trying to dig a canal to re-divert the Mississippi River so that they could get around Vicksburg. And that canal is still, you can go visit that canal. It's, it's really all somewhat filled in now, but you can still see, the U shape of the canal and the historical signs there.
So they're trying to
Um,
dig something deep enough that the water will just naturally go in this man-made
yes, and then
canal.
they could take the
Wow.
gunboats down this new canal around the city and come in from the north, but it never worked. It was so muddy and the ground, so swampy that it just kept collapsing.
Oh,
Now
wow.
today, obviously with our modern earth movers, we could do it, but back then it was all just soldiers with shovels. It's crazy to even think what they were
Right, yeah.
trying to do.
Oh, that's crazy.
But finally, he met with the admiral of the Navy and said, what we need to do is just run the gauntlet and go down the river next to Vicksburg with the gunboats so that we can go around the dry side in Louisiana and meet you down there. And so they did this, and they packed these gunboats with cotton, bales of cotton and hay, to try to keep them from, causing too much damage to the boats. They did this twice, and they only lost 2 vessels during that time. And both of them, one was a barge, and the other one was a not very important boat. But the key gunboats got through, and so then what Grant did was once spring came, the road started to dry, and they built new bridges wherever they needed to, and they created a road on the western side of the Mississippi, and they took the troops down that road out of sight and out of range of the Confederates. And they got all the way down, and a runaway slave told them a safe place to cross, which was Bruinsburg, which, if you ever go to today, is literally a ghost town. You can see all these old buildings, and they're just sitting there with, just possums and raccoons and things like that in there. But Bruinsburg is where they crossed, and it was one of the first major American amphibious assaults, where they crossed a mile-long river, and they were then on dry ground, and they attacked from the south and then around to the east, took out all the opposition, then turned west, laid siege, and the Confederates gave up on July 4th, 1863. And the 4th of July was not celebrated in Vicksburg for the next 70 years or so.
Oh, wow. I did not realize that. Wow. So that's actually the last question I had for you. Did you have anything else to add about this whole period of time and Grant's
Well,
effect?
yeah, the other, I had mentioned that the other place where Grant's strategy really won the war was when he came east to go up against Robert E. Lee. Now, there had been 5 generals before Grant, and all of them had all of the equipment, all of the personnel, and all of the support of Abraham Lincoln that Grant had. But they all lost. The only time that the Union won in the East was when Robert E. Lee came out from behind his trenches and moved into the North. So they lost at Antietam, and then the Confederates did, and then they lost, as we know, at Gettysburg. And both times, though, the Union commanders, McClellan and Antietam, and then Meade at Gettysburg, allowed the Southerners to retreat back into Virginia and get back behind their breastworks, and they were not able to defeat them. Had they both had the spirit of Grant after Antietam and after Gettysburg, the war might have ended in either 1862 or 1863. But because they didn't have that, pounding that Grant had, they let him get away. But Grant was not going to do that. So when Grant led the army to attack in the wilderness, it was a terrible, awful 2-day battle that was made worse because they were fighting in a very thick forest, and the forest caught on fire. And so troops that had been wounded, many of them, scores of them, could not get away from the smoke or from the flames. And many of them died horrifically. And there are accounts of soldiers crying out to their comrades, "Come and get me, the flame's almost here." And in one case, there's an account where two of his friends came out from behind the breastwork to save him, and they were shot down and killed.
Mm.
And so the flames were almost there to this wounded soldier, and the officer shot and killed his own soldier to put him out of his misery so that he didn't burn up in the flames and, die in such terrible pain. Sadly, many, many soldiers did not have such an opportunity, and they died a horrific death. And so the Wilderness Battle, which was a 2-day battle in May of 1864, was actually a Southern victory in terms of the number of killed and wounded. But up to this point, the Northern commanders would retreat back across the Rapidan or the Rappahannock rivers, and they would spend the next 2 months or 3 months retooling, getting supplies, bringing in new troops, getting the old troops who had been wounded to hospitals and healed up and back into the ranks. And Grant said to Meade after the second day of fighting, he said, "Tonight we're moving out after dark, and we're moving south to Spotsylvania," which was south and west towards Richmond, not retreating. Well, nobody knew that except Meade and a few of the officers. And so that night, as the soldiers were getting back into ranks to set off, they didn't know which way they were going. And so they came to this T, and if they turned to the left, it would be a retreat back towards Washington. If they turned to the right, they'd be heading towards Richmond. And so they all kind of watched, where's Grant going to take us? Where are we going? Right. And when Grant came up, he passed the troops and got to that T on that important Brock Road. He turned right. And as soon as he did that, the troops started to yell and shout. They threw their hats in their air, their knapcaps in the air. They set branches on fire and started waving them and creating bonfires. And it was so loud that Grant's horse and Meade's horse started to buck and whinny, and they lost control of their horses, which they were very good horsemen. And Grant said, "This is not good. The Southerners are going to hear us and give us away." Well, the Southerners, the Confederates, did hear them, and they started firing cannon in the direction of the sound because they thought that they were being attacked. Well, they were so far away that the cannonballs just landed harmlessly in the woods. But the Union soldiers were thrilled, and they all started chanting, "On to Richmond, on to Richmond." Well, that was such an important moment and turning point in the war that the statue that is in front of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., is that moment.
Oh, really?
Grant on his horse at the moment of turning right. So next time you go to Washington, D.C., go down. It's between the Capitol building and the reflecting pool. Okay. And there's a wonderful statue of Grant and his soldiers. And that's the moment as he turned right to move towards Richmond. During Spotsylvania, which was another, it's almost beyond belief when you read the descriptions. It rained a lot during the battle, but they just kept fighting, and the ground turned to soup. And so there were places after the battle that they found soldiers buried dead, 7 on top of each other, each one pressed down into the mud. Another one would fall, put down into the mud. Then another would fall, pushed down into the mud. They found 7 stacked on top of each other under the mud.
Wow.
That's how awful Spotsylvania was.
Yeah.
And especially at a place called the Mule Shoe, or the Bloody Angle. And this is called a salient. And it's a place where, because of the geography, you have to have your line, instead of it being straight, it goes into this angle, and it allows the enemy to attack because it's a weak point. And so that's where Grant attacked. And it was a horrific mess on both sides. And so towards the end of that battle, Grant was getting ready to make his plans for his next move. And his friend, the congressman who helped him kind of move up the ladder, was there with him. And he said, "I'm going back to see President Lincoln tomorrow. Do you have a message for him?" And Grant said, well, the proper thing would be for me to write to General Halleck. So could you take a note to General Halleck and he'll share it with President Lincoln? Grant was always that way. He did it by the book, and as much as possible. In war, sometimes you have to be spontaneous too, but for the most part, he did it by the book. And so in that note, he made the famous phrase, there shall be no backward steps. I plan to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. Well, it took all summer, all fall, all winter, and then into the spring. And Appomattox didn't happen until April. So this was June of 1864, and they didn't surrender. Robert E. Lee didn't surrender until April of 1865. But it was this pounding, not giving up. Even when they were losing a lot of men, Grant knew that he could replace his soldiers, but every person that Lee lost, he couldn't replace.
Right.
And so that's where we get the term fighting until the last ditch, or a last ditch effort. Because when you've gotten rid of all your men, all you have left is whoever's in that last ditch, fighting to the last man. They also came up with the term at that point, or at least it became popular, robbing from the cradle and the grave. Now, we use that in dating terms today, but back then they used it to talk about the soldiers that the Confederates were bringing in. After the attack on Petersburg, when Petersburg and Richmond fell, they went in and they found boys 13 and 14 dead in the trenches next to old men in their mid-60s, because they just didn't have any more. I mean, the Confederacy lost an entire generation of men, which is a terrible tragedy. But that was what they were willing to do to continue slavery and quote unquote their peculiar institution and way of life. And it's a terrible tragedy, but Grant understood that he had to fight every day and keep pressing forward. He understood that he had to keep the armies separated. And so he had to keep the Western Army surrounded and separated by Sherman down in Georgia, while Grant kept Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia in and around Richmond. And then Franz Sigel at first was up in the Shenandoah Valley. He was not very effective. So then eventually Grant sent General Philip Sheridan. And so they not only kept them separated, but then they defeated them in the Shenandoah Valley. And the same thing out west with General Banks in Texas and Arkansas. They had to keep everybody separated. And so it was divide and conquer. So these were parts of his strategy. And there's many more. And I mentioned all these different strategies in the book Forward, The Leadership Principles of Ulysses S. Grant.
Go pick it up.
Any final questions? Any final questions?
You've answered all my questions. This is very interesting.
All right. Well, very good. Well, once again, we want to thank you for being with us this week on Stories and Myths. And remember, if you have a question, please feel free to ask it during the program. Or if you're watching this in the archives afterwards, feel free to send an email to me. Just go to vonbuseck.com, which is my last name. You see it down below. VONBUS, follow the bouncing finger, VONBUSECK.com, and click on the contact button and send your message. We'd love to hear your feedback. We'd love to see your questions and do some research to find out what the answers are, and tell the stories that inform, stories that entertain, stories that may infuriate, stories that may enlighten, and even stories that may inspire, but also to debunk the myths. That's why we're here. And so we're so glad that you're here as well. Remember, you can get your copy of Forward at grantforwardbook.com, your copy of Victor at grantvictorbook.com, and all of my books are available on vonbuseck.com, on Amazon.com or wherever books are sold. And John C. Farrell, where is your book available? What is the name of your book?
My book is called The Official NASCAR Trivia Book. That's what it's called. I was trying to give it more title.
Well,
and it's available on Amazon. It's
Amazon.
It was published in 2012, so it is no longer actually in print. But it used to be at the bookstores, but now it is available on Amazon.com.
All right. Well, I hope to see my friends if you're watching and you're going to the Christian Product Expo in St. Louis next week. I look forward to seeing you there, and we'll come back with stories about our journey. I hope to stop at a couple of places and maybe get some video. That's one of the things we're going to start doing, is adding some video. So one of the things, I only live a mile away from a major Revolutionary War battle. And so in the next couple of weeks, I'm going to go shoot some video at that site, and we'll share it here on Stories and Myths. So for John C. Lost My Internet Connection Farrell, I'm Craig von Buseck. We'll see you here again next week, Thursday, 7 p.m. Eastern U.S. time for Stories and Myths. Same bat channel, same bat time.
Same bat channel.